QSO Today episode 456, Jeff Murray, K1NSS. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I'm happy to report that with your help, QSO Today is still here, and that listener support can work. Thanks so much. I'm very grateful. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I am just back from the USA, where I spent 2 weeks with my elderly father on Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, a 30-hour trip in both directions, door to door. Returning to the USA for a brief period once a year is a culture shock for me, especially as one who grew up and spent the first half of my life there. I traveled through 3 international airports, having to either wait or run to my next flight. I lost my wallet on arrival in Chicago and had it returned to me after an hour of looking for it, completely intact, by the friendly folks at United Airlines. Apparently, another passenger in the terminal found it and took it to the service counter. I have thoughts and reflections from this trip that I will share with you in the future. I need to really understand what I experienced before saying anything further. Because of my busy schedule, I'm reprising an interview that I had in June of 2016 with Jeff Murray, K1NSS, a cartoonist and storyteller specializing in amateur radio. Jeff created almost all of the logos and artwork for the QSO Today podcast and the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, and now the QSO Today Academy. Using his dashtunes.com website, Jeff makes social commentary on ham radio in a light-hearted and funny way. The audio has been remastered from the original. I know that you'll enjoy this QSO Today with Jeff Murray, K1NSS. K1NSS, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jeff?
I can hear you, Eric. 4Z1UG, this is Kilo 1, Norway, sugar, sugar. That's just to annoy all the phonetic fanatics.
Right, because they're not using the international phonetic language.
That's right.
Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story, Jeff? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started very early, and I started to mention my books so early in the podcast, but I actually began the first book with the beginning of that story, and it began really on a Christmas day in 1956, I think, in which I was given one of those. It's a Remco radio station, but it wasn't a real radio station. It was this sort of thing with dials on it and a couple of radio antennas on either end. And then it had something that a lot of radio stations don't have on the top, and that was a searchlight. And you could key a buzzer on the thing and for the CW, but you could also key the searchlight, so it was kind of not like a semaphore, but there's another kind of communications with that. So it had that aspect, and it had some dials on it, and I was smitten right there, and I just said this is for me. I want to sit in front of a box at a table with dials, and I want to talk and just be there, So I found my niche in life pretty quickly, and glommed onto the whole idea of radio and calling all cars and all that kind of stuff. And so that was then. And right about the same time, we got our family got our first television, and the thing that happens when you get a television is, in those days anyway, it broke. So then you had to call the TV repairman, and he came, and that was always exciting because he'd pull the set around so you could see what was inside, and I'd pester him. And so then a lot of the tubes would often go. So he'd give me the dead TV tubes. So I would collect those, and they were just these talismans, these little centers of power and everything. Even though they were dead, they still had power for me. So I collected quite a bunch of them because our TV broke a lot. So I had these things. I knew there was something important with them, and I was pretty much stuck on electronics and, by the way, cartooning at the same time. I was got stuck on. My father brought home a copy of Mad magazine. That's the kind of house I lived in. And I got. So I like to draw, but I was interested in all that sort of that whole aura of electronic parts. So then I I went the usual route of crystal sets and whatnot, and then finally started getting the books the first boy, I think the classic boy's first book of radio and electronics, and I took that out, and I was on the path at that point.
That's the Alfred P. Morgan book
That's correct. Yes.
that we seem to hear about in every episode.
I do it. Well, it was those to me. I mean, I'm sort of visually oriented, so I got so sucked into the pictures of the Fanistock clips and the hand wound coils on the wooden. There was a crystal set, I think, that had a coil, but instead of using a round coil form, they used an oblong one. It was just solid wood, and the whole thing of it just captivated me completely. And that, of course, led to eventually in about sixth grade a Night Kit Ocean Hopper, which was the first real shortwave radio I built. And again, I was into the the whole Cold War at this was in the earlier '60s, so it was the whole thing of being able to hear Russia and hear Khrushchev pound his shoe or something. Of course, you didn't hear that kind of thing, but it was there's that whole sort of nuclear war drama that you thought you might eavesdrop on, be the first to know in your neighborhood that World War III had started or something like that. But of course, it wasn't that way, and it was just all this sort of silly propaganda. But I got into the SWL thing, got my fake my pretend call sign from Popular Electronics for the registered shortwave listener, and then I started hearing the hams and again, I knew I wanted to do that more than to be a shortwave listener. So
So when did you get your
led
first
to
license?
all the rest. I got it in I think it was 1963, and I was novice, of course, and at the time, and it was very hard. Learning the code was very, very difficult for me. And I was never very good at memorization, and it was the first really hard thing that I ever had to do in my life. To me, I did fine in school. I was a great reader and everything, so I was okay with that. But the code was tough, and but I just wanted the ham license so badly that I made myself do it, and I think it built my character immensely, because up to that point, if I couldn't do something right away, I just gave it up. And this didn't really. It only changed. Once I got the ham license, I was set for life. Really, I didn't need anything else. But I was quite happy to get that. And oddly enough, I grew to like CW very much, and became a DX kind of a DX hound, CW DX hound, as a general, but partially because I could only afford. My first rig was a DX20, and then when I was a general, I moved up to a DX40 with its modulation of the damned, the carrier control, which was uh, not 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 anywhere near as good as plate modulation. But that's all I had. That's all I could afford with a paper route, so that's what I did. Sank what money I had into a nice Vibraplex presentation key, and I was good to go for the next couple of years until me and my other ham buddies began to get into listening to more music and then electric guitars, and then we made the transition from that's pretty common that I've come to find out. It's from ham radio to rock and roll, and I've run into any number of people who sort of went that route.
If you weren't a guitar player in the 60s, you were left in the dust.
Well, I was left in the dust as a guitar player, actually, but I was I was terrible, but I got to play in a high school band. I was the weak link in it, and it was fun. It's kind of like being on a losing JV football team or something like that, but you were out there, you did it, so you got that under your belt, and you could reminisce and pretend you were a lot better than you really were in retrospect.
What was your novice call sign? Do you remember?
Yes, I do. I it was it was hard. I didn't care for it really. It was WN2EXW, and I you got a lot of time in your hands when you're 13 years old, so you think about stuff like this, and I really didn't care for it just didn't fall off the tongue easily, and it was the only thing I liked about it was the X, because I thought the X has got a lot of, I don't know, it's got a lot of juju or something in it,
Symmetry.
Yeah. But it's mysterious. It's like X-rays and the X-Man and all that kind of stuff. So I was happy with the X, but the other stuff, there was WN2EXW, and that became WB2EXW, because I'm not sure about vanity calls back then, but I wasn't going to get anything like that. So I was just another one of the great unwashed generals running around, and so kind of did that for a couple of years, and had my own. We had a kind of our gang of radio operators, hams, NC beers. This was interesting too, because and I like this, is that at that time, this is prior to the whole rubber ducky CB craze, but there was a distinct CB culture, and a lot of kids kind of went that way. But you were between this is heresy to say, I know, but I think it's true, and that we're all underneath, we scratch us, we're all sea beers, and there's a few people who are very smart and are very hotshot operators and all that, but the majority, I'll speak for myself. I'm probably a C beer underneath, and just kind of getting by with this veneer of ham. I don't know if it's cool or not. It's a sort of strange persona that hams have. That's a little more cooler than CB, but the CBers will beg to differ too. So. That's fine.
Don't you think that what was separating the hams from the sea beers was passing the test?
Oh, absolutely. We thought so. I mean, at the time, I thought, well, these guys, they're sort of the sea beers were kind of the radio kids that were more good time Charlies, and then among the hams, it was. There was all sorts of other subsets too, with the really technically oriented guys, and the operator kind of guys, and I didn't really know any. I was probably the biggest contester and DXer, kind of more obsessive compulsive operator of the time versus technical the technical side. I didn't. I loved it. I loved goofing around, but I had this strange idea that I was going to be an engineer at some. But this is before I met trigonometry and everything, and it was just one of those things. And I always tested well and standardized testing and everything, but when it came to doing it, and this is a perfect example. In trigonometry class, the rest of the class will be doing cosines and tangents and all that stuff, and I'd be drawing a Lampoon movie posters at my desk, and amusing the people around me, and not paying attention. And they all went off to become engineers and assistant secretaries of state for Latin American affairs and things like this. And I went on to be a cartoonist. So,
but everybody has their calling, don't you think?
That's true. That's true. And it's and a lot of times you don't really know what you're calling. It's just this sort of this place that you drift to, and then in retrospect it becomes your calling. But I did stuff that I liked, and so that's why I'm here. So whatever, all you kids listening, don't do what I did.
Did you have any Elmers or mentors that helped you along?
I did. Well, I was going to say the TV repairman was the first one, but I didn't actually have kind of an ongoing Yoda to take me through the passage. I got a couple of neighbors in those days. It was very common to have a bunch of hams as neighbors, and I had a couple right around me, and then there was another one on my paper route, which was in a somewhat different neighborhood, and one of them very kindly gave me the novice test, and another one, and this is kind of an interesting thing too, because the other guy was a man. He was an industrial electrician for General Electric, Joe Swerzak, and he gave me he gave me a bunch of radio parts and ride to the Utica Amateur Radio Club, where I was a member in good standing. And the thing was, Joe had always wanted to get a ham license as a kid, and he certainly had he always had the chops to be an industrial electrician, and so he had the theory all down. But he was one of the people that just had a terrible time with code as a kid, and I guess he just got so darn tired of wishing to be a ham that he around contemporaneous to me, he got his novice license. So he kind of looked to me as an Elmer for code, which was very strange. It's kind of the idea that one could, as a kid, could actually help an adult, Elmer an adult, was novel, and it was kind of, it was nice, and he was great to me. He gave me all kinds of wire and let me, I borrowed an old surplus when I got my general, and I didn't have my VFO yet. He had a surplus World War II signal generator, so just for the hell of it, I borrowed that and tried to use that as a VFO, and discovered I was broadcasting at about 10 different harmonics all up and down the top. So that didn't last very long. But I gave it a shot.
Didn't you find that once you passed the test, that it put you on a different level, even as a kid, on a level with the adult hams?
Exactly. No, we were that whole thing about being on par with adults, or on a certain par with adults, I think is fantastic, and I think that may be the single most, the benefit of ham radio is social, and the idea of, because nowadays people, I think it's been a matter of like a perpetual childhood. People are sort of children forever. But I can remember not wanting to be a kid really forever, and I wanted to, and it was cool to be able to talk to adults on a first name basis and kind of share. Well, yeah, I got this problem with this power supply here, and it was great. I loved it, and I was a shy kid, and so it took it. I had to summon considerable courage to go over to the neighbor's house and ask him to give me the novice test because I'd listened and the funny thing is I was listening to him for I did plenty of due diligence. I listened to him, I found out all this stuff about his life, and he was he was a steam fitter at General Electric, and he was just the nicest guy, but I didn't know he was just this big scary adult who'd be out raking his lawn. So I went up and knocked on his door and introduced myself and was prepared to be shooed away or something. But no, he brought me in and took me down into the shack, and and he had like the perfect station to show a kid, and he had all the classic stuff. He had a Super Skywriter receiver, SX28. He had with an RME preselector, and then he had a homebrew rack transmitter, 813 final, modulated by a pair of 811As with the Mercury Vapor, I guess 866s or whatever, that would pulsate as he talked. So he ran about 500 watts with plate modulation, and it was and D104, of course, and I was in heaven. I really was.
He had the real Remco radio station.
He did, and I've always had a thing for older stuff, but even as a kid, I liked the new stuff. I kind of went that way, but then my real heart was in the 30s. I wanted to be a ham. I wanted to be like Mickey Rooney and be a ham in the 30s. There's something about that period. It was like when radio was still the absolute nuts for kids, and it was legitimately cool. It wasn't a retro thing. It was like the modern thing, but it was very romantic, and the just the way everything looked, the 2000 ohm earphones, the whole kit. I'm crazy, and I still am. That's really where my heart lies. Not really in the 60s, which was my time really as a kid, ham, but farther back.
I had an earlier conversation today with Randy Thompson, K5ND, and we were talking about how once you got the amateur radio license or once you got your novice, that you started noticing things like antennas, things that you never noticed before on people's houses. And as a novice, I used to go knock on doors and say, I'm a ham radio operator. Are you a ham radio operator? And I still do that today.
Do you get stuff? Do you get swag if you do that?
No, but you get to meet a lot of people that you wouldn't meet otherwise, and they become lifelong friends, or they can be.
I know, because there was a guy on my paper route, a ham, and he was kind of a more contemporary guy. He had one of those, and he was hard to miss because he had one of those, those giant all band vertical from, I guess it was High Gain or something like that, but.
Kind of like the High Gain High Tower or something like that?
The big tower, yeah. And then he had like the really fully decked out contemporary Hallicrafter station, and brought me in there, and he was real nice to me, always tipped me well. He ended up giving me a rotatable a dipole for. Actually, it was the one that used to be in the old handbook. It was made out of copper pipe and mounted on insulators, and the whole thing weighed a ton. And I got it home, and I actually used it, and I used it to good effect. It worked well. I think I supported it on my mother's clothesline or something like that. I had some strange not a clothesline, but the clothes pole she
right.
had. And I go out and turn that, and it worked.
Because those were mounted in the ground like a pipe within a pipe.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. You are best known in the ham community for your QSL card designs. You did some cover art for Ward Silver's ham radio detective novel, Zone Iniquity, and you're involved with the B-29 restoration project, and for Dash Tunes, your website, dashtunes.com, where you also make kind of a graphic novel-like stories. How did you discover that you had this talent?
Writing, you mean, or drawing?
Well, I'm in awe of people that have the ability to draw more than a straight line without a ruler. I knew some kids that had this ability, kind of like voodoo, kind of a magic ability.
It is voodoo, and it's a voodoo that I don't have. There are people. It's astonishing. I had to try very, very hard, and I still do. It's not easy for me. It's not. It's. I erase a lot, and I'm not a natural at all. I have to think about what I'm doing, and that it's such a rational process with me is difficult because my attention span is not great. So I really have to concentrate to make that straight line or that curved line without a ruler, as you mentioned. I'm like most people, really. And the thing of it is, I mean, most people, if people want to put in as much time as I have into it, on a continuing basis, you can draw, but most people say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to, I want to go to the lake or something like that. I don't want to sit in a room and do that. That's the way it is. It was a fascinating incident, or not incident, but a time that I had when for a while, I was taking some not drawing classes. They were live. You sketch a live model. A bunch of people would. This is in a artist loft in Boston, and it was just open to anybody. If you paid $5, you could go and draw models. So I went, and I'm there doing trying to construct the figure out of basic shapes, and going to the orderly way that you're supposed to do it. And this older man sitting next to me, the model was sort of coming out of his pen as it went down the page, and it was absolute magic. It was total voodoo, and the picture just came out of his pen, and it was fully formed. And I said, holy mackerel, that's astonishing. How do you? And he said, well, I've had some practice. I was an animator for Fantasia. and he's very interesting man, and he was at the time he was working for the Miter Corporation, which is in suburban Metro Boston, and they're a big defense contractor, and so I guess he was doing animations for them. And he also, he had he had a pretty nice life. He had a studio, art studio in downtown Boston where he painted, and then he did the miter stuff. And then, to keep his hand in, he would come into a session like this. But it was really a privilege just to see him work. So it's voodoo.
Well, there is something else that you're doing. And maybe this is what makes a cartoonist, what a cartoonist does that is different than a painter, an impressionist like Monet, for example. Monet is not really commenting on the state of society. But in Dash Tunes, I read the stories that you write, and it seems that you're a keen observer of the human condition and the ham radio condition. So when you combine the two, they really are funny if you are in the club.
Yeah. Well, my hero, and it's no secret, I've made no secret of it all along. My hero is Gene Shepard, and, who's a humorist, but I think of any...
Ham radio Gene Shepard.
The ham radio Gene Shepard, exactly. A K2ORS, and then he had other calls, I guess, earlier in his life when he was in the Midwest. But, I don't know how many people in your audience, a lot of the older people in your audience probably are familiar with him, and the younger people might be familiar with him to the extent that he's the guy who wrote A Christmas Story with Ralphie and the BB gun and the decoder ring and all that. But he used to do a show on a weeknight radio show on WOR, the 50,000 watt clear channel out of New York City, and for quite a while. I think maybe 20 years or something like that. And one of the things, and he would talk about all kinds of things about growing up and this and that and the other thing, life in general. But he also talked a lot about both being a kid ham, and and this is a guy, and here's a guy on 50,000 watt clear channel station, and he's talking about modulation transformers at Allied Radio, and and messing around with early ham TV stuff. And one of his his all-purpose alphanumeric was a tube number 6SJ7GT, and this guy just knocked me out because he took the ham, a lot of things about radio that I kind of glommed onto, and he kind of went beyond the club, and I think he explained a lot of the whole crocodile brain of the ham radio operator to the greater public about more than anybody. I mean, the guy, I think, was a genius, and I really talk much more than you probably want to hear about my own feelings about ham radio and how it fits into the greater scheme of things. But I think it's important, and he's very entertaining, very funny, and I said I want to be like that. I want to carry on. And he talked a lot about being a kid ham in I guess it would be the 40s. So that's kind of like the optimum time that I like too. But my time in the 60s, he didn't really do so much, although a lot of it applied. So yeah, I do. I think I find ham radio absolutely dead fascinating, and I think I like to write about it. I love to draw about it, and I like to do both. And I mean, I fancied myself at one point that I was going to be a writer, and I actually did try to draw. To write some short story about ham radio. Tried to sell it to Esquire. Esquire wasn't buying, but I've always liked the drawing and the writing together. So I'm kind of a writer who draws, and it's just what I like to do, and it's what I like to do since I saw Mad Magazine, and that's another thing. I saw that when I was like a 6-year-old or 7-year-old, and I said, oh man, this is great, just being silly with words and with pictures. So that's what I do.
Well, you do it very well.
Thanks.
And now this mid-show break. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I'm now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSOTodayCommunity.com website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445 on, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think it is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I'm not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon anymore, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for the transcriptions. There is a new section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. This week's listener sponsors since the last episode are Ed Tipler, WI6RE, $100 annual yearly. New donations since the last episode are Matt Chenoweth, KE0IAT, $100. There were anonymous donors as well, and we appreciate their contributions without mentioning them by name. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. Well, how does ham radio fit in the general scheme of things? Does it improve the human condition?
I think absolutely, and I think it's indicative of, I see it as, it's ham radio, but it's part of the transfer of the magic of technology from the corporate lab and the academic lab to the basement and the attic. And I see it. I think it's the idea that radio was once a laboratory phenomenon, and then the entrepreneurs like Marconi put it to work for business and for shipping. But ham radio was, it's a cliche, but the hams were the early hackers. But it was the idea of people that were just sort of cuckoo for that, for the magic, and they wanted to do it themselves. And it's a very liberating thing. It's not that to even at a very simple level to start doing this and scrounging up parts and the fact that radios at one time were made from stuff that you could find on the junk pile, or you get an old telephone or a spark coil or from a car, or it was like the stuff of radio was like it was almost like stuff that came right out of the ground. It was like wood and galena crystals and a few odds and ends, and the idea that you could, as a kid, in some remote place, you could cobble something together, and it was absolutely liberating. And it's like, and it's funny because you have the old thing about being on the air, and it really is. It gives people a way, individuals, ordinary people, to become airborne, to far exceed, to slip their surly bonds and all that kind of thing, and to become something much more than they originally began. Both vocationally, of course, but it just takes you to places and introduces you to things that before was the kind of, that was reserved for the rich and the powerful, and now, it was anybody, and it's still going on. I mean, um, I think it's very exciting, and I think in a way, and this everybody will probably roll their eyes at this, but that is kind of a stretch. But I think that the individual cell phones, the whole idea of having a cell phone, and it's actually like a computer. Everybody in the world with a cell phone is now kind of a ham. The only thing is you depend on the networks that the corporations and such control, but not the hams. You're still, as long as you have a source of electricity, you're on your own, and that's still the case. And I think that's incredibly appealing. And I'm not, so I'm not surprised that there's this a resurgence interest in ham radio, because it sets you free. I think that it really does in so many ways.
A large number of hams that I've interviewed on the QSO Today podcast would still say, after years of being in the ham radio hobby, that they are still in awe of the hobby and the ability to cast signals into the ether and be heard on the other side of the world. The hobby still fascinates them.
Yeah, I think it's true. I feel the same way. And the idea of my backyard in Saugerties, New York, to your backyard in Mongolia, it's holy mackerel. It's still magic to me. And I'm sure if there's ever an outage on a large scale in terms of the worldwide network, that magic will become ever more compelling to the general population.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I think that what we've seen with Hurricane Katrina and later Hurricane Sandy, that these communications infrastructures are very fragile. And at the end of the day, in the time of a disaster, it's still the hams that are talking.
Right. Personally, I'm not really. I think it's great that there are people who, want to use their ham skills to help the community and in emergencies and things like that. My orientation is not that. It's really much more selfish and trivial. But it gives me a kick. And to tell you the truth, more than this contact or that contact, I think just the amateur radio as a subject of contemplation is more fascinating to me than it has ever been. And and sometimes I think, as a cartoonist and a writer, I feel like I'm in, it's like you wake up in the morning after a snow, and it's like there's this just blanks. It's just nice, beautiful, pristine snow everywhere. And so what do? Well, you go out and you make snow angels and you make tracks in it and everything. And it's like, I just feel that there's so much there that about radio, but about the way the technology and people fit together and people use technology is exciting. And that's ill-treated, I think, in in literature and in general entertainment. Um, I think of uh, uh, the novel by Thomas Pynchon, the Gravity's Rainbow, and I don't know if you've read that or not, but it's pretty it's pretty dense, and he was I believe he was uh, an engineering candidate. So he has a technical background, and he sensitive to that. And he was in the Navy, I think, in some technical capacity. So he's kind of unusual in that among authors, I think, in that regard. And the same with Gene Shepard. Again, these are people that brought a technical a love of technical things over to literary things and to art, and it's not something that happens too often, and so it's exciting because it's kind of like a fresh snowfield to play in, kind of, I think.
You write in, and I think it's Dash Tunes, that you're optimistic about new kid hams, that they really are curious and eager to learn the Morse code. Are they really there, and how do we get more of them?
They're there. I mean, I've run into some, and that very enthusiastic, and the whole thing of recruiting kids is I'm conflicted about that, because I remember as a kid there was a great push at that time to get kids interested in technology from basically become an engineer so we can beat the Russians kind of thing. I think there was something called the National Defense Education Act, and so as a kid, and we were hip to that and kind of looked at it a bit scornfully, because I always felt like, well, that it's so, why would you have to convince anybody to do this? This should be, I always felt drawn to it. It was like this. Nobody had to tell me it was good. And anytime somebody tells me something is good for me, my immediate reaction is, I want nothing to do with it. So I'm, I'm the whole of reaching out to kids. That makes me a little uncomfortable, and it's sort of like, as when I was a kid, the hams that I was attracted to, at least this is another funny thing about we were talking about you have the kids and then the adults at the ham radio meeting, and we definitely hung together, the kids. However, the adults that we sort of cottoned to were the ones, the club members, the kind of club member that sits in the back of the room and has a bad attitude and would yell stuff up, unfriendly things up at the guy and the club president, who would be wearing the tie and everything. And this guy, I remember a guy in particular. He was just the coolest guy. He was an old Navy operator. And he's the guy that would bring the generator to field day, and he was always a little bit tipsy, and he'd say anything to anybody, and we all loved him for that. So it was great. So that was my take as a kid. Nowadays, it's hard to say. So
maybe it's more about reaching out and just exposing them.
Yeah. Being yourself, and having a sense of humor about things and yourself, and not like I'm doing you a big favor kind of thing. It's like, yeah, well, you like it, cool, come on, what do you think? And that I think if you build it and you enjoy it, they will come, kind of a thing. Not, and it when people see my, I have my graphic novels, the first and second. The first one is called Lid Kid Space Cadet, and the second one is what is the title? I got to look at Sky Buddies. That's it. And people see it and it has sort of funny, cute dogs on the cover and stuff, and people say, "Oh, is this something for kids?" I got a nephew who, I got a whatever whose grandson who I'd like to get him interested in this, and I said, "No, no, 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 you don't want to give him this. This'll discourage him from ham radio. It's not for children, and not because there's anything bad in it, but it's the unvarnished." Or as unvarnished as you could pretty much make it the way I remember it. I tried to be true to that, and I think it's funny. I think real life is funny and silly, and it's kind of a warts and all kind of thing, and as opposed to the perfect ham radio kids who smile all the time and are nice, and these my kids are they can be a bit mean to one another, and they take pleasure in the misfortune of the other and that kind of thing.
These are your characters in the book.
Yes, and that's because that's the way it was. I mean, it's adolescence is a tough room, and it's just the way it is. And I think if you're true to that, I think people will be attracted. Thoughtful people, I think, will be attracted to that. Not everybody. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but that's been my experience with ham radio, and it's just one of the funnier aspects of life in general, I think. And I just go and I go to and I was at Dayton recently, and it's like. I see old friends and everything everywhere you turn it's funny, and the people and I'm I don't move myself outside of this funny phenomenon here. I'm in it. I'm part of it. I think it's great. And I'm optimistic. I really am.
You threw me for a loop when I was reviewing the questions for this podcast interview, and I came across your picture, Dayton Never Ending.
Yes.
And I'm sitting there looking at this picture and thinking that you must have embedded some kind of code in it. Until I read the caption underneath it that said it was just the gravel underneath the flea market.
Yeah, well, it's there's yeah. It's well, it struck me there. It's kind of like, like I say, it's sort of the post-apocalyptic scene of the flea market. But the gravel, the busted up pavement, is kind of a Zen thing, and it sort of reminded me of this. And I keep meaning to do it, and I just haven't got around to it. But I wanted to do like a A/B comparison of the Dayton busted up pavement and the Zen garden. I'm probably mispronouncing, but Raiwanji. It's a famous place where they have the sort of like a building, a square enclosing a courtyard, and there's it's that sort of raked gravel effect with isolated plant, very serene and a contemplative scene. And I was kind of that's Dayton's kind of analog to that.
You're a regular attendee of the Dayton Hamvention, and the subject of the Hamvention has come up in the podcast more than a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Dayton Hamvention a source of inspiration and dreams for you in terms of what you do in ham radio?
Oh, yeah. In terms of...
maybe in terms of what you write about in ham radio.
Oh, yeah, completely. Oh, yeah. It's like a total petri dish there, and you see. I mean, and it's in a relatively circumscribed area, so you can, if you have the time, and I was there, and I sort of had my own thing to pursue with the meet and greet for the QSL designs and stuff, but you can't help but soak up the atmosphere and the individuals and the whole zeitgeist of it it's fabulous. Sometimes very depressing as well, but it's that's life, you know. It's both those things, and it can be funny and kind of rueful at the same time. There's a whole mix of emotions come out of it. Um, um, but you know, the people that you see and the friends that you reconnect with, and make are, you know, everything. It's just everything. I think it's wonderful, and I would like to take this opportunity. You know, I make fun of Dayton a lot, but I want to just tell everybody that on, I think it was Saturday, I had left my hotel about 7 o'clock in the morning to get to a city bus that was going to get me to the Hara, and I missed the bus. So here I am, you know, this old fart, and he's the knapsack on his back, and he's walking down the road, and this guy sees me and does a sort of rum runner 180 and says, "You look like you're going to Dayton. Can I give you a ride?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So he got me there, and he's just the nicest guy. And he was one of the, I believe, I don't, and I, you know, I'm remiss. I don't have his call and name in front of me, but it's a K8, I believe. And he was one of the members of the directors of putting on the show, I guess, in past years, not this year. And he was just the nicest guy, and it was the sweetest thing to do. And I thank him very much. And that's another part of the Dayton experience, which is very, very good.
You say that you fell into a smattering of de-expeditions. Which de-expeditions, and what did you do for them?
Oh, well, I for Heard Island, I did the most recent de-expedition to Heard Island. A couple of years ago, I was contacted by, I did a custom QSL card for Rich Hall at KY6R, and he, you know, looked at some of my stuff and asked me if I'd like to work on a logo for them. So I did, and I put that together, and that was maybe a year or so before before the expedition, or maybe more. And so I did that, and then what Rich was interested in, and I thought it was a really cool idea and pretty innovative. He wanted to use graphics on a continuing basis as a build up to the expedition itself, as part of the fundraising process, bring attention to it. And so I began to do that, and I did sort of these supplementary promotional graphics promoting the expedition and the fundraising efforts, and with some holiday themes and the Christmas cards from Heard Island, things like that. So we had a kind of a running graphics show leading up to the expedition, and I think it generated a fair bit of interest. Just, you know, the idea in general, and then once the expedition started, what I did was I had my character Dash the dog-faced ham. I had him stow away aboard the Braveheart, and I carried the storyline on, and I had these periodic updates from Dash, reading Proust on the deck of the Braveheart, and everybody's ignoring him, and he's very just bummed out by that. But so I had, and I continued this throughout the expedition with a whole storyline, and I'll eventually be putting out some kind of a unofficial, official Heard Island sketchbook covering Dash's adventures on Heard Island. So what began as just a logo turned into this whole sort of graphic complement to the expedition, which I was really privileged to be a part of, and you know, brought me a great deal of attention, which I'm most thankful.
Have you ever actually been on any of the DXpeditions yourself?
No, no, I, the only thing that remotely comes close is I personally activated uh, in Iota Island off the coast of Maine, New Hampshire. I used to live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I got an entree to set up at the Jackson at the Marine Lab on the Appledore Marine Science Lab on Appledore Island, which is run by University of New Hampshire and Cornell. And so I set up. It was me, and I had my rig there, and me with the tanks full of lobsters there, which I thought were part of some study. And I asked the guy, and he said, "Oh, no, no, those are dinner." So, 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 so it was me and the lobsters until they got cooked, and I operated K1NSS portable from Appledore Island, which is one of the it's called, the group of islands is called the Isle of Shoals, and one of those islands, I don't know how far Smutty Nose beer gets sold, but one of the islands just next to ours was Smutty Nose, so it's an interesting kind of historic island group, and kind of obscure, but I had a good time there. I wish I had a buddy pole, and I wish the conditions weren't so hot. But I managed to get out and make a mess, give people a new island. So that was fun, and I liked that. But as far as the real D expeditions go, like Herd Island, I think I'd rather be.
It's easier for Dash the dog to go.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he's more rough and ready than I am, and that isn't saying much. So,
what rig do you operate now?
I have an ICOM 718, which I got when I first got back into ham radio in 2001, and this is kind of fun too. I got my relicensed, and then I got a job. I was living in Massachusetts at the time, and there's Ham Radio Outlet has a store in Salem, New Hampshire. So I got a job there, and then I got the employee discount there, so that helped. It was a very generous discount. It was a great place to work. I had a ball. I worked weekends, and so I basically made my radio money there. And spent pretty much anything I made. I spent that day. So, but that's where I picked up the ICOM, and I've had that ever since. And
you operate which modes?
The CW and sideband, and I prefer. To tell you the truth, for rag chewing, I prefer CW mainly because it gives you a chance to think of something to say. Where I don't have mic fright really, because I worked in radio for a while. I worked in production doing commercials and writing copy and at a local radio station. So I'm used to being with a microphone and all have in front of me, but there's something about rag chewing, which on the air, which is for whatever reason makes me freeze up a little bit. But in CW, you could sort of relax, and I'm not a hotshot guy anymore. Anyway, I mean, I used to operate 35 words a minute pretty comfortably, and now I'm probably a bit below 30 comfortably. So I'm not the operator I used to be, but I like that, and there's a certain, what I like, to tell you the truth, it's specific to a band. I love 160 CW. I love the idea of the gentleman's band, and everything is relaxed, even though it isn't now with all the DX, but at least that's the rap anyway. And
the top band.
The top band, yes. And I love that. I love that whole sort of. Again, it's a sort of old time vibe, and everybody's courtly and all that. I think that's great. And
What kind of keyer do you use?
I just use the keyer that's in the radio, and then I have a Kent single paddle, um, the dual paddle business. I know that was kind of rubbing your stomach and patting your head kind of thing for me. So it's because I'm an old bug operator, and so I'm just more used to back and forth like that, just with the one paddle. I did get a bug again, which I used for when I picked it up at Ham Radio Outlet, used an old one, but um, once I got the Kent, I liked the keyer. It was easier to control than a bug, and it was cleaner. So I do that. I used to, and when I was a kid too, I really had a lot of fun with a straight key. I got pretty good with it, and I kind of prided myself on my fist, and I really enjoyed sending fast with a straight key. But when I got back into it, I couldn't do that anymore. It was really pretty raggedy, and I guess it's just the time that gets everybody in the end.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Concentrate on civility and try not to become narrowcasted into a particular kind of ham radio. And this is I gave some thought to your questions about the advice and what to do about it and stuff. The thing that I'm worried about, or not worried about, but is the fragmentation of ham radio to a certain degree. There's it's interesting. It's good. There's so many sub-genres of ham radio now. There's such a variety to it. It's really bewildering. But I'd hate to see everybody become just sort of creatures of their own niche and not part of a larger thing. And I'm sorry when we have these big contest weekends and stuff, and people get very upset at contesters for being contesters. And there's I can see where they some of the behavior all around can be pretty shaggy, but I like the idea that we're all kind of stewards of the air kind of thing, and we're all this sort of fellowship of the radio sort of thing. And this is maybe it's just my own funny little take on it, but what we have in common, I think, is great, and it's kind of we have some important knowledge about how the world works and how things work and the technology, and we're kind of keepers of that. And at a local, everyday, ordinary person level. And I like that idea. I like that there's this sort of community of keepers of the knowledge, and it doesn't, not necessarily that it's all that deep or anything like that, but it's like we're a group of people that know how to put a simple antenna up and know how to fiddle with some radios and kick them in the right place to make them work and stuff like that. And it's great that the civilization that has a bunch of people like that to look after that stuff. And to that degree, I like to see people civilized behavior where people kind of recognize their common interest, their commonality. And I guess I'm saying, why can't we all just get along?
Hams are obviously a reflection of the larger population, and I guess at this point, in this political year, people are becoming very polarized, and I see some of this polarization in ham radio too, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm with you. I see that we have a higher responsibility as hams. We are keepers of our ham radio ether that extends from DC to blue light.
Right. It's, and I hate to go, to be the responsible one. It's almost as if you could appeal to people to be responsible in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, and
right.
Yet sort of serious. To be deadly serious about it, it's ridiculous. It's the whole thing. It's ridiculous. So you can't be too serious. You kind of got to approach it obliquely, and I think by example, it's corny to say, but it's true that if we're a little bit courtly and a little bit friendly and kind and welcoming, you could still joke about it and everything, but there's a certain goodness about that. There's a goodness and wholesomeness about the fellowship of the radio, which I think is very funny on one hand, and I think it's very cool also.
With that, Jeff, I want to thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I'm a new fan of Dash Tunes and look forward to your observations on our hobby. Thanks, Jeff, in 73.
Thank you for having me, Eric. It's been a great pleasure and a lot of fun talking with you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jeff. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K1NSS in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcasts by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.